This is film curator Linnea Beyer talking about our film series at the end of the month, WUNDERKINDER, the directors of the new German cinema. And one of the reasons that I wanted to take a look at this film movement is that for American audiences, it is something that is often overlooked. A lot of people know about the French New Wave with directors like Chabrol and Godard, or the American New Wave with directors like Scorsese or Bogdanovich. But when people think of German cinema, a lot of times they think of Das Boot or maybe Run Lola Run, but they aren't really aware of the rich history that the cinema has in that country. And so, and looking at the New Wave, it really is important because it is a renaissance for the German cinema. The German cinema was probably at the top of its game during the Weimar period in the 1920s, especially with expressionistic cinema from directors like Fritz Lang or Murnau. And after World War II began, a lot of those directors left Germany and immigrated to America. And during World War II, the cinema was appropriated for propagandist means. After World War II, the cinema in Germany was dismantled. Many of the people who had worked in the film industry were Nazis, and the country was left not feeling very comfortable with the idea of films being made by Nazis. So the films that were made in the 50s were called Heimat films, homeland films, very formulaic, no real artistic merit, and were for the German population. There was almost no exporting of German films to foreign markets, and the number of films that were made per year diminished, almost exponentially. In the early 60s, a lot of young filmmakers were making shorts and wanted to reclaim German cinema. And so in 1962, they held a festival in Oberhausen and signed the Oberhausen Manifesto, stating that the old cinema is dead, we need a new one. And they proclaimed that the makers of shorts, while educational, needed a means to make films that were entertaining, that had artistic merit. And the German government took this seriously and set up subsidies for film and for television. And a lot of filmmakers used both mediums at the time to make films that were personal, but that also became commercially successful and ultimately, and most importantly, gained international recognition. And so we have a lot of these directors at the festival. There's Wim Wenders, kind of the existentialist of the bunch, who was really obsessed with the idea of the Americanization of Germany and used a lot of American influence, put that into his films, particularly American music. We'll be screening his film Wings of Desire on Tuesday, and it looks at the divide in Berlin, and it is one of the most beautifully shot films ever made. The world of the angels is all shot in black and white, and the world of humans is in color, and then eventually the two collide. It's a really wonderful romantic film. Then we're also showing two films that kind of reference the expressionistic cinema of the 1920s, kind of homages. The first is The Last Revenge, which is a very weird cult film that harkens back to the great film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And then we're also showing Werner Herzog's homage to Murnau's Nosferatu. We're also showing films by Fassbinder, the most prolific filmmaker of the era. His Marriage of Maria Braun features the actress Hanna Schigula, who's known as the face of New German cinema. That'll be on Thursday. And then over the weekend, we're bringing in Volker Schlöndorff. For our German audience, it's a well-recognized name, but for Americans, maybe not as much. He is actually the first German director to have won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Picture for his film, The Tin Drum, which we'll be screening the digital director's cut of. Like so many of his other films, it's based on a novel, and this particular film is a parable of the rise of Nazism in Germany, and it features a little boy who, at the age of 3, decides literally and figuratively that he doesn't want to grow up, and he protests the violence in the world that he's born into by not growing up and by banging on his tin drum. We're also looking at the world of children and how it is a parable against the rise of Nazism and the apathy that was prevalent in Germany by screening a film called Young Torlis, which was Volker Schondorf's first film. And then we'll also be looking at other movements in German history through his cinema. For instance, on Sunday we'll be screening 2 films that deal with the terrorism that was prevalent in Germany in the 70s. The first was made in 1975, and Volker shot that with his wife, Margarete von Trotta. And it's called The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. And it looks at a young woman who has a one-night stand with a man who is a suspected terrorist. And then she is suspected of terrorism herself. And there's a huge smear campaign done by the media against her. And it's a film that is really important today, even though it was shot in the 70s, because it holds up a mirror to post-9/11 America. Now, shot later on in 2000 is The Legend of Rita. And again, it looks at the same point in time, terrorism in the 70s. It also has a female protagonist, but this woman actually is a terrorist. And after she can no longer live in Germany, she has to create different legends or different lives, lives in secret after that period in time. But when the wall falls in Berlin, all of a sudden, all of those different lives come back to haunt her. And of course, it's interesting because it looks at that period in time, but it's also made well after that in 2000. And one of the things that happens with New German cinema is that the directors began to leave, like they did in the 20s, and make films in America. But they eventually returned to Germany, like Volker did, to make films like The Legend of Rita. And looking at that period where the directors leave to make films in America, we're also screening Volker's film, The Handmaid's Tale, which was partially shot at Duke in North Carolina. And that is a science fiction film that's also based off of a book, the Margaret Atwood novel, that looks at a world where the majority of the people can't have children. And so the few women who can are rounded up and made into handmaids. And again, is another political look at the world through a parable, through the film Parable.